The flood came on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, Henry Caldwell was gone. So was everything he had ever built. Nora stood at the water's edge with $14.30 in her coat pocket, two boys behind her, and nothing in front of her but mud scattered timber and the black foundation stones of a house that had taken her husband 3 summers to build and the river less than one night to destroy. She was 31 years old. She had never owned property. She had never stood before a judge. She had never in her life been asked to prove that she deserved her own children. She was about to do all three. What she did not know yet, standing there in the September mud of the Atchafalaya Basin in the last years of the 19th century, was that the man who would try to take everything from her had already signed the paperwork. Not the custody papers. Those came later. The timber contract. He had signed it before Henry was even buried. And what she could not yet know, because she had not yet met an old man living alone on a house that floated, was that the water her husband had spent his whole life fighting was not her enemy. It was the only thing that was going to save her. This is the story of Nora Caldwell. And of the rope she learned to let go. The flood came on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, the Atchafalaya had pulled back into its channels the way a man pulls a knife from a wound, slow, deliberate, leaving behind everything it had taken and everything it had broken. The water receded into the cypress roots, and the Spanish moss hung still and dripping in the grey September air. And where there had been a house, the day before there was nothing but a black rectangle of foundation stones and the smell of river mud baking in the first pale sunlight. Nora Caldwell stood at the edge of the water with her boots sinking into the soft bank and looked at what remained of the life her husband had built. It was not much. 3 summers Henry had spent on that cabin, 3 summers of cutting and hauling and fitting timber by hand, working in the heat that came up off the basin like breath from something alive, working on weekends when the trapping was slow, and on evenings when the light lasted long enough to drive another nail. He had been proud of it, not the boastful pride of a man who needs witnesses, but the quiet kind, the kind a man carries in his shoulders when he walks through a door he built himself. Nora had loved that about him, the way he moved through the rooms of his own making as if the house and the man were one thing. The house was gone, Henry was gone, and behind her in the flat-bottomed skiff she had borrowed from the widow Perkins, her 2 sons sat without speaking. Reuben was 14. He sat in the bow with his back to her, the way he had been sitting since they left Pierre Part that morning, the way he had been sitting, it seemed to her, since the moment 3 weeks ago when the neighbors came to tell her what the river had done. He was built like Henry, wide through the shoulders, already hands that looked borrowed from an older man. He had Henry's stillness too, that particular quality of silence that was not emptiness but weight. He was not a boy who cried easily. He had not cried at all as far as Nora knew, and that frightened her more than tears would have. Jasper was 7. He sat at her feet in the bottom of the skiff with one hand trailing in the brown water, the way children do when they are not yet old enough to understand that the water is the same water that killed their father. He had been drawing pictures in the mud on the skiff's floor with a stick he found somewhere. Nora did not ask what he was drawing. She pulled the skiff through the last of the shallows with the push-pole and let it come to rest against the soft bank and stood there looking. The foundation stones were blackened with river mud. The timbers that had formed the walls lay scattered across 60 yards of ground, splintered where the flood had broken them against the cypress knees, some of them driven part way into the soft earth by the force of water that had no interest in what men had built. The roof was gone entirely. She had been told it was seen floating as far south as Morgan City, riding the current like a raft with no one on it, moving fast and purposeful, the way things move when they no longer have anything to hold them in place. Nora stood and looked at it for a long time. Then Jasper spoke. He had climbed out of the skiff and was standing on the bank beside her, his small hand finding hers. Without looking, his eyes moving across the wreckage, the way a child's eyes move across something he is trying to make sense of and cannot. "Mama," he said. "Yes." "Why is Mr. Guidry's house still there?" Nora looked where he was pointing across the open water to the north, and she saw it. She had not noticed it before, or if she had not registered what she was seeing. But now she looked. The Guidry place, the old trapper's property on the far side of the channel, was a low wooden structure sitting perhaps 2 feet above the surface of the water, connected to nothing solid, floating among the cypress trunks on a platform of logs, its rope lines running to the trunks of 4 living trees and disappearing into the water below the current waterline. The flood had come and gone, and the Guidry house had gone nowhere. It had risen with the water, and when the water fell, it had fallen with it, and it sat there now in the September light, intact and ordinary, a thin line of smoke rising from the tin chimney, as if nothing particular had happened. Nora stared at it. She had lived in this parish for 11 years. She had passed that house by water and by pirogue 100 times or more. And she had never until this moment truly looked at it. She had seen it the way you see things that are simply part of the landscape, unremarkable, expected, already categorized and filed away in the part of the mind that deals with the familiar, a floating house, old Guidry's place, nothing to do with her. But now Henry was dead, and her own house was a scatter of broken timber across 60 yards of river mud, and she was standing on a sinking bank with $14.30 in her coat pocket, and the house across the water was still standing, still floating, still there. She looked at it for a long time, then she pulled the skiff in and began filling the burlap sack she had brought with anything salvageable, nails pulled from split timber, a cast iron kettle she found half buried in the mud near the old hearth, 3 hinge plates that had survived intact. The boys helped without being asked. Reuben pried nails free with a length of scrap iron. Jasper carried the smaller pieces to the pile near the skiff. Nobody talked. When the sack was full and the light had begun to go gold in the cypress canopy, she pulled them back through the bayou channel toward Pierre Part. They had been sleeping in the back room of the Perkins boarding house for 3 weeks. Nora had $14.30. The boarding house cost $3 a week. She did the arithmetic without wanting to. The parish courthouse sat on the only ground in Pierre Part that did not flood, a low bluff above the levee, maybe 8 feet above the surrounding basin, the kind of elevation that felt like arrogance out here where everything else was water and mud and root. Nora climbed the worn wooden steps alone the following morning, leaving the boys with a neighbor woman who had been kind in the weeks since Henry died and stood before the clerk's window. The clerk was a thin man with reading glasses and the particular manner of someone who has delivered difficult news so many times that it has become a form of courtesy. She told him what she needed to know. He told her. In Louisiana, he explained without inflection, as if reading from the document itself, the law descended not from English common law as in the other states, but from the Napoleonic Code, the French civil tradition, the only such legal system in the Union. Under this code, a mother was the natural tutor of her minor children upon the death of the father. That was the protection. It was real. But it could be challenged by close male relatives, by anyone who could demonstrate to a court's satisfaction that the mother was unfit to provide for the children's well-being. The court would weigh her fitness. And if I have no dwelling, Nora asked. The clerk removed his glasses and polished them. Then fitness becomes considerably harder to demonstrate, Mrs. Caldwell. The court prefers to see a stable home, a fixed residence, something that suggests permanence. I have no money to rebuild. He replaced his glasses. He looked at her over the rims of them with something that might have been sympathy or might have been professional neutrality. It was hard to tell the difference. Then I cannot promise you an outcome. She thanked him. She walked back down the courthouse steps into the September heat. Her hands were steady until she reached the bottom step, then they were not. Aldous Varney arrived from Nashville 3 days later. He came on the afternoon coach, a leather traveling case in one hand and a black silk cravat at his throat that was completely and utterly wrong for the heat of South Louisiana in September. He was 40 years old or thereabouts. Thinning dark hair parted with mathematical precision, a gold watch chain that caught the light when he moved. The kind of man who had learned somewhere along the way that the most effective form of authority is performed gently. He took a room at the Perkins house, paid for 2 full weeks in advance, asked after the boys by name. That evening he came to the back room where Nora and her sons were staying and knocked twice lightly as guest knocks when he is certain of his welcome. Nora opened the door. Nora? His voice was the voice of a man who had thought carefully about what he was going to say. I've come a long way, out of concern for Thomas's boys. Surely you know that. She looked at him. He was Henry's older brother. She had met him twice in 11 years of marriage, once at a funeral in Nashville, once when Henry had borrowed money from him to buy the Cypress parcel and had paid it back within the year. Henry had not spoken of him often. When he did, it was with the particular economy of language that men use when the subject is complicated. Come in, she said. He sat in the single chair. She stood. The boys were in the corner, Jasper asleep already, Reuben watching from his cot with the particular watchfulness he had inherited from his father. Aldous was kind. That was the thing she would remember later, the quality of the kindness, how real it sounded, how it sat in the room, the way something genuine sits with weight and warmth. He spoke about the boys' education, about the climate here and what it did to children, about the instability of life in the basin, about what Henry would have wanted. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. I will file the tutorship papers at the courthouse within the week, he said near the end. The boys will be raised properly, schooled, fed, kept out of the fever and the wildness of this swamp. I will manage their land until they come of majority. It is the only decent course. Nora kept her hands very still. Reuben is 14, she said. He will not leave. Reuben is 14 and a minor. The kindness remained, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. The sheriff will assist if necessary. Nora, you have no dwelling, you have no income, you have no male relative to stand for you before the court. I am asking you to be reasonable. She did not answer. He stood, smoothed his trousers, picked up his hat from the table where he had set it. You have until the 31st of October, 90 days. The inspection is then. I am giving you that time out of respect for what you and Henry had together. He paused at the door. I am not your enemy. He left. Nora sat down on the edge of the cot and looked at the floor for a long time. Reuben had not moved. When she finally looked up, he was watching her with Henry's eyes. Ma, he said. Not yet, she said. Let me think. She could not sleep. At 2 in the morning, she was sitting at the small table in the back room with the lamp turned low and the boys breathing in the darkness behind her, and she was listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling around her, the creak of the old timber framing, the distant call of something out in the bayou, the soft percussion of a moth against the window glass. She had gone over the arithmetic again. $14.30, $3 a week for the room, 90 days. The numbers were not complicated and they were not good. She was thinking about the floating house across the water. She was thinking about it the way you think about a problem whose solution you have not yet seen but whose shape you are beginning to feel, the way a blind person feels the edge of something in the dark, one careful fingertip at a time. She did not hear Aldous leave. She had not expected to hear him. His room was at the front of the house and hers was at the back, and the building was large enough. But what she heard at some point in the quiet hour before midnight was the front door of the boarding house open and close, and then the sound of boot heels on the wooden porch, and then voices low, male, the particular register of men who do not want to be overheard. She sat very still. The back room had a single window that looked out onto the narrow side alley between the boarding house and the hardware store next door. The voices were coming from the front porch. She could not hear the words. She could hear the tone, businesslike, efficient, the rhythm of men concluding something they had already largely decided. She got up quietly and went to the side window and opened it 3 inches. The voices were clearer now, carried around the corner of the building on the still night air. She recognized Aloysius' voice immediately. The other was a man she did not know, a flat northern inflection, the voice of commerce rather than place. She heard the word cypress, she heard the word timber, she heard quite clearly the figure $2,400. And then she heard Aldous say in the same measured, reasonable tone he had used in her back room not 2 hours ago, "The land is manageable once I have control of the estate. The boys are the mechanism. Williams will have their contract by December." The voices moved. A horse shifted, boots on the street. Nora stood at the window in the dark for a long time after the voices stopped. He had not come for the boys, he had come for the cypress. The boys were the mechanism. She stood there in the dark and she felt something shift inside her. Not rage, not grief, not the particular hot panic she had been living with for 3 weeks. Something older and colder than any of those things. Something that had to do with recognizing quite clearly and without any remaining ambiguity what she was actually dealing with. She went back to the table. She sat down. She picked up her pen. At the top of a blank sheet of paper, she wrote in her careful schoolteacher's hand, "What I know, what I can prove, what I need." She wrote until the lamp oil ran low and the moth had all gone wherever moth go before dawn. Whitmore Giddens kept his office in a small wooden building beside the courthouse, a single room with shelved document boxes, floor to ceiling on 3 walls, and a desk that had the organized solemnity of a man who understood that the difference between a legal document and a piece of paper was the stamp he kept in the top left drawer. He was 54 years old, gray-haired, wire-rimmed spectacles, the unhurried manner of a man who has spent his career in the service of precision. He had been parish notary for 22 years. He had known Henry Colwell since Henry first came to the basin as a young man, had notarized the deed to the Cypress parcel, had witnessed the land transfer when Henry paid off Aldous's loan. He rose when Nora entered and offered her the chair across from his desk without ceremony. She told him what she needed. He told her what the law said. Louisiana Civil Code Article 15. The tutor's duty was the care of the person of the minor, not merely the maintenance of a fixed address. Article 1493, Forced Heirship, the provision by which children in Louisiana could not be disinherited, their share protected absolutely from alienation for another's profit. Henry's sons owned that cypress land already. Aldous could not take it. He could only control it through controlling them. "Then his interest is the timber," Nora said. "His interest is the timber," Whitmore confirmed. He removed his spectacles and polished them, a habit she would learn that preceded whatever he said next that mattered most. "There is a matter of motive. If your brother-in-law made contact with Williams Lumber Company before filing his tutorship petition, that is documentation of intent. The company's clerks keep records of every inquiry. Can you write to them? I cannot advocate for parties in a legal matter, but you can write. And a letter that passes through this office carries the parish seal, which lends it a particular weight that a private letter does not." He paused. He replaced his spectacles. "There is one other matter." He said it carefully, the way a man says something he has been deciding whether to say. "Henry came to see me in the spring. Before the flood, he was not here on a legal matter. He came to ask me about a man named Cormac Frey." Nora was quiet. "Cormac Frey has lived on a floating home in the basin for 38 years, Whitmore said. "He is 74 years old. He was, before he came here, an engineer of some considerable reputation, hydrology, levee design, flood control. He designed structures along the lower Mississippi in the years before the war. One of his structures failed in the spring of 1859. The flood that followed killed 12 people. He paused. He came to the Atchafalaya afterward and he has not left. He lives on water because he says it is honest. He says the river tells the truth about itself and solid ground does not. Why did Henry ask about him? Whitmore looked at her over his spectacles for a moment. Henry had met him. Out on the water, I believe, some months before. Cormac had offered to teach him the floating construction, the technique of it, the anchoring, the materials. Henry came to me to ask whether I knew the man's reputation, whether he was trustworthy, and I told him the man was entirely trustworthy and had been for 38 years. He paused again. Henry thanked me and left. He did not go back to Cormac Frey. Nora sat with that for a moment. He refused. 3 times, as I understand it. Whitmore's voice held no judgment. He was reporting. The 3rd time I was not present, you understand. I have this second hand. The 3rd time Henry wept. The room was very quiet. Outside, the September heat pressed against the windows. A horse went past in the street. Someone called a name across the square. Why, Nora asked. Not why had Henry refused. She thought, sitting there in the quiet of Whitmore's office, that she was beginning to understand that. What she asked was, why did he weep? I cannot say with certainty. Whitmore folded his hands on the desk. But Cormac Frey told me some months ago when I passed him on the water that Henry Colwell was the finest man he had met in 30 years on the basin, and that he was afraid of the wrong things. Nora sat in the chair for another moment, then she stood. I would like to draft that letter to William Slumber today, she said, before Aldous hears of my plans. Sit down, said Whitmore Giddens. I'll get the seal. They found Cormac Frey the following morning. 3 hours by skiff through channels Nora knew only partly, channels that narrowed to corridors of cypress and opened suddenly into wide blackwater lakes and narrowed again, the basin shifting its geography the way it always did, the way it had been doing since before there were people here to mark the changes. Jasper trailed his hand in the water. Reuben navigated from the bow using Henry's old hand-drawn map, which was wrong in several places but right enough. The floating home came into view around a stand of Tupelo gum. It was larger than she had expected, 20 feet perhaps by 16, a solid rectangular platform of cypress logs sitting level and still on the water between 4 living trees connected to each by a rope that disappeared into the water below and reappeared above in a large generous loop around the trunk, the kind of loop that could slide. The walls were cedar plank weathered to gray. The tin roof had been patched in several places with pieces of different metals, none of which matched, giving the structure the appearance of something repaired by intelligence rather than built by money. A small iron stovepipe rose from one corner. On the porch, a narrow extension of the platform at the front, an old man sat in a wooden chair mending a cast net with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had learned long ago that hurrying nets accomplish nothing. Cormac Frey was 74 years old. He was not a large man. He had been perhaps once. There was the architecture of it still in his frame, the broad shoulders, the long hands, but age and the basin had reduced him to something more essential. His beard was full and white and carefully kept, which surprised her. His eyes, when he looked up from the net, were the particular grey of river water in winter. He looked at her for a long time before he spoke. You're Henry Colwell's wife? Yes, I heard about Henry. He set the net down across his knees. Come aboard, Mrs. Colwell. Bring the boys. The platform shifted slightly under their weight as they stepped on a gentle living movement, nothing like the hard indifference of solid ground. Jasper froze for a moment, feeling it, then looked up at Cormac with an expression of absolute attention. It moves, Jasper said. Everything that survives moves, Cormac said. Sit down. He made coffee on a small iron stove inside the main room, a compact, efficient space that had the quality of a ship's cabin, everything fixed or folded or hung, nothing loose. The logic of a man who had thought carefully about what happens when the water moves unexpectedly. The coffee boiled without spilling. Jasper stared at the stove as if watching a conjurer. Nora sat across from Cormac at the small table. Reuben stood in the doorway watching. She told him what she needed. He listened without expression. She told him about Aldous, about the 90 days, about the tutorship petition, and the cypress timber, and the figure of $2,400. She told him about Whitmore and the civil code. She told him about the conversation she had overheard from the side window of the boarding house at midnight. When she was finished, Cormac was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know why he wept." She waited. "Henry was not a weak man," Cormac said. "He was one of the least weak men I've met in a long time. But he had built himself around an idea of what a man was supposed to be, what kind of man he was, what kind of life he was building. A farmer, a landowner, a man with ground under his feet that he had made into something with his own hands." He looked at his coffee. "I offered him something that required him to become a different kind of man, not worse, different. And he couldn't do it, not because he was afraid of the water, because he was afraid that if he gave up the ground, he gave up himself." He looked up at her. "I told him that the river doesn't care who you've decided to be. I told him the water is not his enemy and not his ally. It is simply the truth of where he lived, and you either learn to live with the truth or the truth buries you." He paused. He wept because he knew I was right and he did not know how to change in time. The platform shifted gently on some slow, invisible current. "I have perhaps 3 months," Cormac said. "My lungs. I know what it is." He said it without drama, the way an engineer reports a structural finding. "In that time, I can teach you what I know. The construction, the anchoring, the materials, the way to read the water, the way to build something that rises and falls with what comes rather than resisting it." He looked at her steadily. "But I am not a kind teacher, Mrs. Caldwell. I will not tell you that you are doing well when you are not. I will not spare your feelings when your technique is wrong. I taught your husband 3 times and could not reach him, and I have thought since then that perhaps the failing was mine, that I was too patient, too gentle, trying to preserve his idea of himself while teaching him to change it." He shook his head. "I will not make that mistake again, not with the time I have." "I don't want kindness," Nora said. "I want to be ready by the 31st of October. Cormac looked at her for another moment. Then he looked past her at Reuben, still standing in the doorway. "You'll work too," he said to the boy. "Yes, sir," Reuben said. "And the small one?" Jasper looked up from where he had been examining the rope coiled on the porch. "The small one learns knots," Cormac said. "He starts today." They went home that evening, the long way through the wide channel that ran past the ruined cabin site. The light was going gold in the cypress canopy, and the water had the hammered copper color it got in the last hour before dark, and Reuben was rowing steadily and Jasper was asleep in the bow. Nora sat in the stern and looked at the 4 black foundation stones as they passed. She looked at them for a long time. Then she looked away toward the north, toward the basin, toward the place where she had first seen that morning with Jasper's small hand in hers, a house that was still standing. She had $14.30. She had 90 days. She had an old man with 3 months of breath who did not believe in kindness, and she had Reuben behind her pulling the oars through the copper water with his father's hands. That night, back in the boarding house, she sat at the small table with Whitmore's borrowed copy of the Louisiana Civil Code open beside her and Henry's journal open in front of her and the lamp burning low, and she made a list. The materials she would need, the costs, the cypress logs, driftwood from the bayou free, hemp rope from the hardware store in town, 3 bundles at $1.80 each, $5.40, pine tar for pitch, 25 cents, nails and tin roofing salvaged from the ruins, no cost, the cast iron stove already recovered, lamp oil, 20 cents the month, She looked at the numbers. She looked at them again. She could do this for under $8. $10 remaining for flour and salt and coffee and whatever else 3 people needed to stay alive and working through October. She looked at the civil code. She looked at the journal. She looked at the lamp flame. Then Reuben came through the door from the alley where he had been helping the boarding house keeper stack wood, his palms red and blistered from the work, his shirt dark with sweat. He stopped when he saw her face. "Ma, sit down, Reuben. I want to tell you what we're going to do." She told him the building part first, the cypress trees, the 4 ropes, the platform, the way the loops would slide up and down the trunks as the water rose and fell so they would never flood and never strand. The separate garden platform for rice and beans and squash. The chicken coop on its own small float. Reuben listened without interrupting, the way he always listened, with the full weight of his attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Papa didn't do this," he said. Why didn't Papa do this? She had been expecting the question. She had been thinking about how to answer it since Whitmore's office, since Cormac's platform, since the moment she had really understood what Henry's refusal had cost him. She looked at her son. "Because your father came from people who built on ground," she said. "And he wanted to be a man who built on ground. That was who he believed he was." She paused. "He wasn't wrong about what he wanted. He was wrong about what the land would allow. The land here is water, Reuben. You can't be a ground farmer where the ground itself disappears half the year." Reuben looked at his blistered hands for a long moment. "If I help," he said, "all the way through, do we get to stay together?" "Yes," Nora said. "We stay together. That is the entire point." He nodded once, the way his father used to nod once, conclusive, done. Outside, the bayou moved in the dark. Somewhere far out in the basin, something called once across the water and fell silent. Nora turned back to her list. The 31st of October was 90 days away. She had a great deal of work to do. The first morning they went out to build the basin was wrapped in fog. It came off the water before dawn, the way it always did in late September, low and white and total, erasing the distinction between water and sky, between the living and the drowned, between what was there and what was gone. Nora pushed the skiff out from the pier, part landing in the grey pre-light, with Reuben in the bow and Jasper between them, and for the first 20 minutes of the journey she could see perhaps 15 feet in any direction, just the dark vertical lines of cypress trunks emerging from the white and disappearing back into it, the water black beneath them, the sky invisible above. She had been on this water for 11 years. She knew the channels by feel more than by sight. She did not tell the boys this was how she was navigating. She just navigated. Cormac was already awake when they arrived. He was standing on the porch of his floating home in the fog, with a cup of coffee, watching them come through the cypress, and he did not wave or call out. He simply watched. The way a man watches something he is evaluating, the way an engineer watches a structure settle under its first load. They tied the skiff to the platform cleat, stepped aboard. The platform shifted slightly and then settled. "The fog will burn off by 9, Cormac said. "We'll have good light by then. Until then, Jasper learns to rope." He sat the boy down on the porch with a length of hemp and began to teach. Not gently, not with the patient repetition of a schoolroom, with the economy of a man who understood that time was finite and precision was not optional. Bowline first. The loop that does not slip, the loop you can trust your weight to, the loop a sailor ties in the dark by feel alone, because his life may one day depend on doing it correctly without light. Cormac showed Jasper once, slowly naming each movement. Then he handed the rope back. Again, Jasper did it wrong. Again, wrong in a different way. Again. On the 7th attempt, Jasper tied a bowline that held. Cormac examined it without expression. "Again," he said. Jasper looked at him. "Until you can do it without thinking," Cormac said. "Until your hands know it better than your mind does. The knot doesn't care how smart you are. It only cares what your hands have practiced." While Jasper tied and retied, Cormac took Nora and Reuben to the water. He had chosen the site already, 4 living cypress trees on the Colwell parcel, old growth, standing in water that held a minimum depth of 3 feet even in the driest month of the year. The space between them formed a rough rectangle 24 feet by 18. He had measured it the week before, he said, when he heard what had happened to Henry. He did not explain further. He showed them how to read the trunks. Every cypress tree that stands in water carries a record of its history on its bark. The dark stain lines left by high water, the pale wood above them marking the seasons of drought, a layered chronicle written in flood and absence. Cormac ran his hand along one trunk the way a doctor runs a hand along a patient's side, reading by touch. This line here, he said, pointing to a dark band perhaps 4 feet above the current water line. That's last year's peak flood, this one below it 3 years back the bad spring. You build your platform to sit 2 feet above the current surface. Your rope loops must accommodate at least 6 feet of rise, probably 8 to be safe. You build for what the water can do, not for what you hope it will do. Reuben was watching the trunk carefully. How do you know which flood was which? He asked. You learn the basin's years, Cormac said, the way you learn a man's face. It takes time. For now you trust the marks and you build with margin. He looked at the boy. A structure with no margin is a structure waiting to fail. Your father's cabin had no margin. It was built exactly to the line of what a good year allowed. A good year is not every year. Reuben said nothing, but he kept his eyes on the trunk. They felled the first cypress log that morning, a dead fall from the previous spring's flood, already cured, already floating half submerged in the shallows 50 yards from the building site. Cormac directed. Reuben cut. The cypress cut was different from hardwood, he explained, straight down, following the soft fibrous grain, not angling across it, because cypress would split along the grain if you gave it the opportunity, and a split log was a useless log. Reuben cut wrong the first time. The axe glanced and took a chunk rather than a clean curve. Cormac did not raise his voice. Again, he said, straight down like you mean it, not like you're asking permission. The second cut was better, the third was right. By noon, the fog had burned off and the September sun was on the water, and Nora was in the shallows, up to her knees, helping guide the log into position while Reuben lashed it to the frame with the clove hitch Cormac had shown him that morning, and Jasper sat on a root above the water line, tying and untying bowliness with the methodical focus of a child who has decided that this particular thing is worth understanding completely. Cormac sat on a cypress stump on the bank and watched. Some days his breathing was easy and he worked alongside them, his old hands still precise, still capable, demonstrating a lashing technique or showing Nora how to test the joint by weight before trusting it to the full load. Other days he sat and watched and talked, and those days where Nora came to understand perhaps the more valuable ones, the days when he put into words what 40 years of living on water had taught him about the relationship between what men built and what the river did. Your first instinct will always be to build tighter, he told her one afternoon, watching her lash a cross member to the frame. Tighter feels safer, tighter feels like control, but on water tight is how things break. The joint that cannot flex will fail at the first stress. The joint that has a little play in it, that gives a little, that absorbs rather than resists, that joint is still there after the flood. Nora tightened the lashing another half turn. Cormac looked at her. What did I just tell you? He said. She looked at the lashing. She looked at her hands. She loosened it one turn. Better, he said. But you'll do it again. You'll keep doing it until you learn to trust what you cannot feel directly. The looseness feels like failure. It is not failure, it is design. The second week, Aldous Warner rode out on a rented horse to the building site. He came along the bank trail in the mid-morning when the light was good and the progress was visible, the platform frame already taking shape between the four cypress trees, the logs lashed in their grid, the whole structure floating level and solid 4 inches above the water line. He pulled his horse up at the edge of the bank where the trail ended at the water and looked across at what Nora was building. Nora was in the water up to her thighs, testing the tension on a corner, lashing her back to him. She heard the horse. She did not turn. "What is that?" Aldous said. "Materials," Reuben said from the platform without looking up. "Those are logs." "Yes, sir." Aldous looked at the floating frame for a long moment. His horse shifted under him. He was calculating. She could feel it from across the water, the particular quality of silence that belongs to a man who is revising his estimates. "Nora," he said, "what exactly do you intend?" She turned then. She looked at him across the 20 feet of water between them. She let him see her face clearly, not defiant, not hostile, simply present. "I intend to be ready for the inspection," she said. "Last day of October, I believe you said." He looked at the frame. He looked at her. "You are building a floating shack," he said. The kindness was still in his voice, but it was thinner now, stretched over something else. "I'm building a home," she said. He watched her for another long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward town without another word. That evening Nora heard from Whitmore, who heard it from the courthouse clerk, what Aldous had said at the saloon, that Nora Colwell was constructing a raft that would sink at first rain. That 2 young boys living on such a thing through a Louisiana winter was evidence enough of a mother's unfitness that the court needed to see this situation resolved before Christmas. 3 of Henry's oldest friends in the parish, men who had worked alongside him, shared his table, carried him in their memories, had been at the saloon. They had listened. They had not disagreed. Nora received this information from Whitmore on a Thursday afternoon. She thanked him. She went back to the building site. She worked until the light was gone. The 3rd week, the community pulled away. It happened the way these things happen in small places, not all at once, not with any single declaration, but gradually in the accumulation of small withdrawals. The woman at the dry goods store, who had always greeted her by name, now found reasons to look at her ledger when Nora entered. The neighbor who had watched the boys in the early weeks was suddenly busy whenever Nora asked. At Sunday service, which Nora attended once more before she stopped going entirely, the visiting preacher spoke on the proper order of a Christian household with a specificity that left no room for misunderstanding, and Aldous sat in the front pew and nodded throughout, and 3 deacons, Henry's friends, stood afterward to shake Aldous's hand. A man named Craddock, who had owed Henry $12 for 3 years on a cow trade, appeared at the boarding house one afternoon and pressed the coins into Nora's palm without meeting her eyes. "I will not have it said," he told the floor, "that I held a debt against a woman in your situation." He left before she could speak. Nora stood in the doorway and looked at the coins in her palm and understood what the payment meant. He was not paying a debt. He was purchasing distance. He was making sure that whatever happened to Nora Colwell, he could say he had settled his accounts beforehand. She put the coins in her pocket. She went back to work. On a Wednesday in the 4th week, Whitmore told her the numbers. 6 widows had lost husbands in the spring flood. Of those 6, 4 had already signed tutorship transfer papers. The first had signed within 6 weeks. Her 2 daughters were now working as household servants in Baton Rouge, a house she had never seen chosen by the male relative who had taken her children. She received no portion of the sale of her late husband's land, which had been sold to a timber interest for $900. She was permitted to visit her daughters twice a year. The 2nd and 3rd women had signed under similar circumstances. The 4th had died, it was said quietly, of something that had no medical name. Of the 2 who had refused to sign, one had a father in New Orleans with money enough to hire a lawyer from the city. That woman had prevailed. That woman's father had stood before the court in a black coat and spoken for 40 minutes with the authority of a man whose money was old enough to have its own reputation. The other was Nora. Whitmore told her this without editorializing. He was a notary, he reported, he did not advise. Nora sat across from his desk and looked at the document boxes on the shelves behind him. 40 years of the parish's legal life stacked in labeled rows, every deed and marriage and succession and tutorship petition, every transfer of land and child and future, all of it reduced to paper and stamped with the parish seal and filed in the correct box on the correct shelf. And the Williams Lumber letter, she asked. No response yet. It has been 11 days. How long does it typically take? For a company inquiry of this nature, 2 to 3 weeks, perhaps 4. He polished his spectacles. The inspection is in 53 days. She nodded. She stood. I need to get back to the site, she said. By the end of the 3rd week, they had a platform. It sat level and solid between the 4 trees, 18 inches above the current water line. The cypress logs lashed in a double grid that Cormac had designed, and Nora and Reuben had built, checking and rechecking every joint, every lashing, every load-bearing connection. When all 3 of them stood on it together, and Cormac too on his better days, it did not flex and did not tip and did not creak in any way that suggested weakness. Cypress, Cormac had explained, did not sink. It was full of natural oils resistant to rot and water absorption in a way that no other timber in the basin matched. You could submerge a cypress log for 100 years and pull it out, still floating, still sound. The basin itself was proof of this. Half the deadfall timber drifting through these channels on any given day was cypress that had been in the water for a generation, still as buoyant as the day it fell. Your husband's cabin was pine and oak, Cormac said one afternoon. Good timber for ground construction, wrong timber for here. He knew the woods, but he built with the wrong knowledge in the wrong place. Reuben, who was planing a salvaged cedar plank for the wall framing, paused in his work. He did not ask anything, but Cormac saw the pause. He was not a foolish man, Cormac said to the boy rather than to Nora. He made a decision based on what he knew and what he believed, and the 2 things were both real and both insufficient. That is not foolishness. That is what happens when a good man's world is smaller than the problem in front of him. Reuben went back to planing, but something in his shoulders had changed slightly. Some tension Nora had been watching for 3 weeks had released an increment. She noticed. She said nothing. Cormac arrived one morning in the 4th week and could not leave the skiff. His nephew, a young man of 20 or so, who rarely spoke and paddled with the effortless efficiency of someone raised entirely on water, brought the old man to the site as usual, but when the skiff came alongside the platform, it was clear that Cormac could not make the step across. His nephew looked at Nora without expression. Nora helped lift the old man onto the platform, one arm, then the other, and felt in his frame the difference between last week and this, the way weight shifts when the body begins to consume itself. She settled him in the chair they had brought from the boarding house for him. He sat for a moment with his eyes closed and his breath coming carefully the way a man breathes when each breath is a negotiation. Then he opened his eyes and looked at the platform around him and the walls going up and the rope lines running to the 4 cypress trunks. Show me the northwest anchor, he said. Reuben showed him. The loop on the northwest tree, the timber hitch that he had practiced 40 times on land before bringing to the actual construction, the large, generous loop sitting loose around the trunk with enough clearance to slide 4 feet up without catching. Cormac looked at it carefully. The loop is large enough, he said. But look at the hitch itself. Look at where it sits on the trunk. Reuben looked. It's sitting flush, Cormac said. No, you want it flush, but you want the wraps of the hitch to sit lightly. See how the second wrap is pressing hard into the first that will bind under load, under a real load, flood load, surge load. That binding is where it will fail. He talked Reuben through the correction without touching it himself, the boy's hands on the rope, the old man's eyes on the boy's hands. 3 adjustments, then Cormac looked at it again. That will hold, he said. He looked at Jasper, who was sitting cross-legged on the platform retying a bowline, for what was probably the 100th time. Come here, he said. Jasper came. Cormac took the boy's hands in his own and looked at them, looked at the palms, the fingers, the calluses already forming at 7 years old from weeks of rope work. Do you know why I keep making you practice? He said. So I get it right, Jasper said. So your hands get it right, Cormac said. Your mind will be frightened in a storm. Your mind will be thinking about the water and the wind and your mother and your brother and everything that can go wrong. Your hands cannot afford to think. Your hands must already know. That is why we practice until it is not thinking, until it is only doing. Jasper nodded. He went back to his bowline. Cormac sat and talked for the rest of that morning while Nora and Reuben worked. He talked about the basin the way a man talks about a place he has loved for a very long time, not with sentiment but with the precise affection of deep knowledge. He talked about the flood cycles, about the relationship between the Gulf and the river, about how the cypress forest regulated water in ways that the levee engineers in New Orleans did not fully understand and probably never would. He talked about his years as an engineer, about the logic that had seemed so sound, and the morning in 1859 when the sound logic had failed and the water had done what water does when you give it enough pressure and a sufficient weakness. I built that levee to withstand a 100-year flood, he said. I was proud of that specification, 100 years. It failed in 11. He paused. It failed because I designed it to hold the water back. I made it rigid and dense and strong, and I did not build in any capacity for the structure to yield. When the water came in at 112 years force instead of 100, the levee could not absorb the excess. It resisted until it couldn't, and then it failed completely. He looked at the rope lines running to the cypress trunks. These ropes do not hold the water back. They hold the house to its place while allowing the house to go where the water goes. There is no resistance. There is only accommodation. And because there is accommodation, there is no catastrophic failure. The worst that happens is the house rides too high or too low. The house remains. Nora listened and worked. She was learning these weeks that Cormac taught on 2 levels simultaneously, the technical and the philosophical, the instruction about rope and timber and the instruction about something larger, something that had to do with the relationship between human intention and natural force. She was not always sure which lesson she was receiving at any given moment. Sometimes she thought they were the same lesson. On a Thursday in the 5th week, the walls went up. Salvaged cedar planks from Henry's ruined cabin, most of them still sound, needing only to be pried loose from the wreckage and planed clean of mud and rots at the edges. Reuben had been making trips to the cabin site every few days, recovering materials, nails pulled from split timber, hinge plates, the iron brackets Henry had used for the window frames, even the hearthstones from the old fireplace hauled out of the mud one by one and stacked on the bank. The chimney took 3 days. Reuben and Jasper rebuilt it piece by piece from the scattered stones of Henry's old hearth, the same stones reassembled on the platform above, a sand base mortared with a clay and lime mixture Cormac had specified. It was not a large chimney. It did not need to be. It needed to be sound, and it was. The cast iron stove, recovered whole from the cabin foundation in the first week, cleaned and re-seasoned, fit into the corner of the main room, as if the room had been designed around it, which it had. The tin roof sheets, rust-patched but structurally sound, went on in overlapping rows, hammered flat with wooden mallets to avoid the sharp sound of metal on metal that carried too far across the water and told too many people too much about what she was doing. By mid-October, there was a house. Not a grand house, not a comfortable house by the standards of Nashville or Nashville's idea of what comfort required, but a house, a real one with walls and a roof and a floor that did not flood and a chimney that drew correctly and 4 anchor lines that held it precisely where she had chosen to build it. Nora stood on the porch one evening in the second week of October and looked at what she had made and felt something she had not felt since the morning after the flood. She felt like herself. That same week, Cormac told Reuben about his father. It happened the way certain important conversations happen sideways without announcement while both people were occupied with something else. Reuben was measuring rope lengths for the garden platform extension, and Cormac was sitting in his chair watching the water. And the old man began to speak about Henry, the way you speak about someone when you have been carrying the memory of them and the weight has finally become ready to be set down. He told the boy things Nora had not known. Henry, at 15, coming into the basin for the first time with a borrowed knife, and the particular combination of ignorance and determination that either gets a young man killed or makes him into something worth being. Henry, at 19, learning to trap in the winter channels with a patience that surprised everyone who expected impatience from someone that young. Henry, at 22, falling in love with a school teacher from the north part of the parish and deciding with a completeness that admitted no revision that he would build her a life on solid ground because that was what she deserved and what he intended to provide. He decided that Cormac said before he understood what solid ground meant in this basin. And once a man like your father decides something, the deciding becomes part of who he is. Changing the decision means changing himself. He looked at the water. That is not weakness, that is the particular kind of strength that becomes a trap. Reuben measured rope without looking up. The trap is, Cormac continued, that the world does not care what you have decided to be. The water does not consult your self-image before it rises. The flood does not make exceptions for a man's dignity. He paused. I told him that. He knew I was right, and he could not in the time he had find a way to be right and be himself at the same time. Reuben set down the rope. Did he know? The boy asked. Did he know it was going to happen? No, Cormac said. He did not know the flood would come for him specifically. But he knew, I think he knew that he was living in a manner that the water would eventually correct. He knew it the way you know something you are not ready to act on. He looked at Reuben directly. That is why he wept, not because I showed him something frightening, because I showed him something true and he was not yet ready to be changed by it, and some part of him understood that not being ready had a cost. The basin was very quiet around them. Reuben picked up the rope again, but his hands were still for a moment before he went back to measuring, and in that stillness, Nora, watching from the doorway, saw her son receive something that could not have been given to him any other way by any other person at any other moment. She did not interrupt. And then the log split. They had been lashing the primary cross member for the garden platform extension, a second floating structure smaller than the main platform designed to carry the soil boxes for late season planting, connected to the main house by a short rope bridge. The log was a good piece, straight grain, the right length, cured to the right degree. Reuben was driving the final lash in tight when the grain opened without warning along an invisible fault line, a clean split 7 feet long, the whole piece spreading apart with a sound like a rifle shot across the quiet water. A full day's work gone. Nora sat down on the platform. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and sat there and did not speak for a moment. Ma, Jasper said from the water where he was treading the shallows. Ma, it's only a log. It's 7 days we don't have, she said. The words came out flat and factual, and she did not apologize for them. Cormac had been watching from his chair. He coughed, a long, effortful cough that had been getting worse across the weeks, and when he could speak again, his voice was thinner but steady. You will have another log by Tuesday, he said. Sit down, drink some water. We cannot wait for Tuesday. You cannot prevent Tuesday, he said. Those are different things. Sit down. She sat, she drank the water Jasper brought her scooped in a tin cup from the rain barrel. She sat on the tilted corner of the porch and looked at the split log and breathed and did not speak. On Tuesday morning, before full light, a cypress log drifted around the eastern anchor tree on some slow current from the upper basin, 6 inches longer than the one that had split, straight-grained and sound still carrying its bark. Reuben had it pulled and positioned before Nora was fully awake. Jasper had the lashing rope ready. By breakfast, it was in place. Nora looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Cormac. He was drinking his coffee with the expression of a man who has lived long enough to have stopped being surprised by the river's logistics. "The basin brings what the basin brings," he said. "This is what I mean when I say you do not fight it. You wait, you prepare, you are ready when it comes. That is the whole of the philosophy, Mrs. Caldwell. Everything else is just carpentry." 3 weeks before the inspection, Cormac arrived one morning, and his nephew had to carry him aboard. The grey in his face had deepened since the previous week. His breathing was the sound of a man moving carefully through a house full of things that might break. He settled into the chair on the porch and looked out at the water and the house Nora had built and the 4 rope lines running to the 4 cypress trunks, and something in his expression was the particular quietude of a man who has arrived somewhere he intended to arrive. He called Reuben to him. The boy came and crouched beside the chair, the way you crouch beside someone who should not have to look up to speak to you. Cormac spoke quietly. Nora was at the stove inside and heard only the register of the words, not the words themselves. Later she would ask Reuben what he said. Reuben would tell her almost all of it. He told the boy the spool of rope coiled on the porch, the long piece, the one Cormac had brought with him that morning, the one with the particular twist of a man who learned his rope work from someone who learned it from someone who learned it on the river. That rope was for the 4th anchor. He had belled it that morning before he was well enough to paddle. He had wanted to bring it himself. He told Reuben to tie the 4th anchor with that rope and with no other. He said, "Tie it loose. Looser than you think is enough. Looser than you dare." He said, "Your mother is the head of this house. You are the hands and the back. Those are not the same thing, and they are not interchangeable, and the difference between them matters. Your father learned this too late. Do not learn it too late." He said Reuben's name once plainly at the end, and then he closed his eyes. The nephew took him back at noon. Nora helped Cormac into the skiff. The old man's hand found hers for a moment and held it, not with pressure, just presence, the way you hold something you are about to set down. "I will not see you again," he said. "You'll see the inspection report," Nora said. Something moved in his face that might have been a smile. "Goodbye, Henry's Nora," he said. The skiff moved off through the cypress. She watched it until the fog of distance took it, and the shape of the old man and his nephew dissolved into the grey-green of the basin. Jasper came and stood beside her. "Is he going to die, Mama?" "Yes, baby." "Why does he get to die at home?" She looked at the 4 rope lines, at the cedar walls, at the thin smoke from the stovepipe rising straight in the still air. "Because he knows where home is," she said, "and home is the place you choose to be at the end." Jasper thought about that. "Is this our home?" he said. She put her hand on the back of his head. "Yes," she said, "this is our home." 9 days before the inspection, the storm came. It built through the afternoon, that particular Gulf storm architecture of the late season, warm and enormous, the sky going from blue to copper to an ugly yellow-gray, that Nora had learned in 11 years in the basin to respect completely. The wind began in the cypress tops an hour before dark, moving the Spanish moss in long, slow waves, and by the time she had shuttered the windows and locked the stove door and brought the chicken's small float in, tight against the main platform, the sky was a single dark mass, moving northeast, and the water was beginning to show the short, steep chop. That meant the wind was close to the surface. She and Jasper sat on the cot and held hands and listened. Reuben was in the basin. He had taken the skiff that morning to Pierre Part for supplies, planning to be back by late afternoon. He had not come back. The storm had come instead. Nora sat and held Jasper's hand and listened to the wind work on the roof and felt the platform move beneath her, the living, responsive movement of a structure that was not resisting, that was doing what it was designed to do, rising and falling and swinging slightly on its lines. And she kept her breathing steady, and she did not think about Reuben being on the water in this. She told herself he had made sure, she told herself he was smart and he had Henry's instincts and he had pulled up somewhere before the storm hit. She told herself this with as much conviction as she could manage, which was not as much as she needed. At midnight, the wind shifted. At 3 hours past midnight, the northwest anchor rope snapped. The sound of it was a single hard crack above the roar of the wind, like a branch breaking or a rifle shot, or the specific sound of something giving way that you never forget once you have heard it. The platform swung hard on its three remaining lines, the northwest corner rising and then dropping as the tension redistributed, and the corner struck a cypress knee at the waterline with a force that drove a split up through the lower seam of the platform, not catastrophic, not sinking, but open, a 3-inch gap along 18 inches of the seam, water seeping in with the methodical indifference of water that has found a way. She found the bucket, Jasper found a wooden bowl. They bailed in the dark, taking turns, the lamp swinging in the gimbalet holder Cormac had shown her to mount above the door the split cypress seam, admitting perhaps a cup of water every 2 minutes, manageable if they did not stop. They did not stop. By dawn, the storm had passed, and the basin was the color of weak coffee, and the platform was sitting slightly low on its northeast corner, and the garden extension was half submerged, the potato rows drowned in the night, the cabbage heads swollen and soft with water. Only the rice still stood. Rice knew water. It was the one crop that could not be drowned. Nora sat on the tilted corner of the porch with her hands in her lap and looked at the ruined garden and the split seam and the broken rope trailing in the current from the northwest anchor tree. She could not at that moment bring herself to stand up. The shore beyond the cypress ring produced 2 horses an hour after sunrise, Aldous Varne and Sheriff Beckett Holt. Aldous called across the water, "Mrs. Colwell, I have brought the sheriff as a witness to what the night has done. This confirms what I have said these past weeks. The inspection is 9 days from today. I am advising you with every compassion I possess to spare yourself and your children the difficulty of what is coming. Pack what you need. I will arrange proper accommodation." Nora looked at him across the water. She looked at Aldous on his rented horse in his wool suit that was wrong for this climate and this place and this conversation. Then she looked at Sheriff Holt. Holt was a heavy-set man in his 50s, quiet-faced, watchful. He had not spoken. He was looking at the damaged platform, at the split seam, the low corner, the trailing rope, the submerged garden. Then he was looking without moving his head at something further away. Nora followed his gaze. Henry's old cabin. What remained of it? The foundation stones black and permanent. The timbers scattered across 60 yards, some of it driven into the soft earth, none of it ever coming back. The roof that had floated to Morgan City, the walls that the water had simply removed. Holt looked at the old cabin, then he looked back at Nora's floating home, split, tilted garden, half destroyed, still floating. "Ma'am," Holt said, his voice was quiet-pitched for her alone. "That cabin on the high ground, your husband's—" "Yes." The flood took him there, yes. "And which structure is still standing this morning?" Nora looked at the ruined cabin on the high ground, then she looked at her own platform seam, split corner, low rise, standing straight in the flooded garden, the lamps still burning inside through the open door, Jasper visible at the table eating cornmeal from a tin cup. "Mine is," she said. Sheriff Holt nodded once he touched the brim of his hat. 9 days, Mrs. Colwell." He turned his horse. He rode after Aldous without another word. Nora sat back down on the porch. Jasper came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her. They drank in the morning light, the sun coming up through the cypress, the water still holding the storm's chop but diminishing, now settling. the basin returning to itself the way the basin always did, without apology, without drama, simply becoming again what it had always been. She was thinking about the rope. She was thinking about the northwest anchor and the way she had tied a timber hitch, tied very tight, tightened twice because she had been afraid, tightened because tightness felt like safety, tightened because the water was rising and she could not stop it rising, and the one thing she could do, the one thing that felt like control, was make the rope tighter. She had tied the rope that way because she had been trying to hold on, and the rope had broken. That night alone, long after Jasper was asleep, she found Henry's journal on the shelf above the stove and took it to the table and opened it and read. She read the entries she had read before: the first year of the cabin building, the second, the trapping seasons, the small notations of weather and yield, and the domestic life she had shared with him. And then she found the entry she had passed over in earlier readings, or had read without fully understanding, or had simply not been ready to receive. It was from the third summer of their marriage. The ink was slightly faded, the handwriting more careful than his usual style, as if he had written slowly and deliberately. He had written, "Cormac asked me again today. I told him no again. I don't know why I keep refusing. I know what he's offering is right. I know the cabin is built wrong for this place. I know it every time the spring flood comes and I see the water rise and I watch his place sit level on the water, and I know what I've done and why I've done it. I think I'm afraid, not of the water, of what it would mean to admit that a man I barely know is right about my life, of what it would mean to be the kind of man who lives on a raft instead of solid ground. I think this is my pride. I think Cormac is right and I am wrong, and I am choosing wrong because I cannot find a way to be right that also lets me stay who I believe I am. This seems important to write down. I don't know what to do with it yet." Nora read it twice. She set the journal down. She looked at the northwest corner where the rope had been. She looked at her hands. The hands that had built this place. The hands that had tightened the rope twice because she was afraid. The hands that had, without knowing it, done what Henry had done, held on too tight to something that needed to be held loosely. She went out onto the porch. The broken rope lay coiled where it had fallen, the timber hitch at its end still intact, the break in the rope itself 6 inches back from the hitch. She picked it up. She looked at the hitch. It was tight, exactly as tight as she had made it. The wraps pressed hard into each other the way Cormac had warned her about, and she had not fully understood until right now, holding the broken end in the dark, the water moving quietly beneath her, the basin all around her in the September night. She sat down on the porch with the coiled rope in her lap. She sat there for a long time. The water held her even now, tilted seam, split corner low. It held her the way it had always held Cormac's house, the way it would hold anything that was willing to move with it instead of against it, the way it would hold her home if she could really learn, not just intellectually, but in her hands and her chest, and the part of her that tied ropes too tight in the dark because she was afraid if she could learn to build loosely enough to survive. Reuben would need to come home. She had 4 anchor ropes to retie, and she needed hands that were not yet old enough to be afraid of letting go. Reuben came back on his own. She had not gone after him yet. She had been had been thinking through the morning about what she would say and how she would say it, had been sitting with the broken rope in her lap and the journal open on the table and the arithmetic of what remained. 9 days, 4 anchor lines to retie, a seam to patch and recaulk, a garden to assess and replant where replanting was still possible, a letter still waiting from William's lumber, a courthouse still waiting at the end of it all. She had been preparing to go after him when she heard the skiff. She came out onto the porch and saw him moving through the cypress from the south channel, rowing with the steady, unhurried stroke he had developed over these weeks, Henry's stroke. She had thought more than once the same economy of motion, the same absence of wasted effort. He had been on the water through the storm after all. He had sheltered on the bank somewhere and ridden it out and come back when it was over, the way you came back from the things you could not prevent. He pulled the skiff alongside and tied it without looking at her. She waited. He stepped up onto the platform and stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the damaged corner, the split seam, the northwest anchor tree with its rope gone, the half-drowned garden. He looked at it all with the systematic attention of someone assessing what needs to be done rather than mourning what has been lost. He looked like Henry in that moment, exactly like Henry, the width of him in the shoulders, the stillness, the face that did not perform what it felt but held it inside where it could be used for something. Nora did not tell him about the rope yet. She did not tell him about the journal entry. She did not tell him about the letter she had started writing in the dark and had not finished and had left on the table where Jasper could have seen it. She said, "I need you." He looked at her. "4 anchor ropes," she said. "All of them need to come off and go back on. I've been tying them wrong." He looked at the northwest tree, at the empty loop of the anchoring, at the trailing rope in the current. "Wrong how?" he said. "You get too tight," she said. "Like, I've been tying them as tight as I could make them because I was afraid, and tight is how they break." He was quiet for a moment. "Cormac told you that?" "Cormac told me that weeks ago," she said. "I heard it. I didn't learn it. There's a difference." She paused. "I need someone to tie the ropes who isn't afraid yet, who hasn't had long enough to learn the wrong kind of fear." Something moved in his face. "You're afraid," he said, not challenging, genuinely asking. "Yes. You built the whole thing." "I built it holding on too tight," she said. "Like, the building was right, the holding was wrong. I need you to tie the loops loose enough to slide. Loose enough that everything in you says it isn't enough and you tie them that way anyway." He looked at the anchor trees for a moment, all 4 of them going around the platform with his eyes, the way Cormac had taught them both to read a structure systematically, without rushing, starting at one corner and moving clockwise until you had seen everything. "You think I can do that?" he said. "Tie it right when you couldn't?" "No," she said. "I think you'll tie it wrong too the first time, but I can correct you when you're wrong, and I cannot correct myself because I cannot see my own hands clearly enough right now." She looked at him steadily. "That is the honest answer." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Show me the journal." She had not told him about the journal. She had not mentioned it. He had known somehow, the way children know the things parents have not said, the way people who live in close proximity in small spaces develop a sensitivity to the unsaid that is almost indistinguishable from instinct. She brought it out. She had the page marked with a strip of cedar plank shaving. She handed it to him open. He read it standing on the porch in the October morning light, the water still carrying the last of the storm's restlessness beneath them, the platform shifting slightly, the 3 remaining ropes creaking at their anchor points. He read it once, then he read it again. She watched his face and saw what moved through it. Not grief exactly, or not only grief, but something more complex than grief. The specific emotion that belongs to understanding something about a person you love that you did not understand while they were alive and can no longer ask them about. He handed the journal back without speaking. She waited. "Papa knew," he said finally. "It was not a question." "He knew some of it," she said. "He didn't know all of it. None of us know all of it while we're in it. He knew he was wrong about the house. He knew the house was wrong for this place," she said carefully. "He didn't know how to be himself and also fix it. That's a different thing." Reuben looked at the water for a moment. "Is that why you're telling me so I don't do the same thing?" Nora looked at her son, at his father's hands and his father's stillness and the 14 years of himself that were entirely his own and not his father's at all. "I'm telling you," she said, "because you deserve to know who he was. All of it, not just the part that was easy to be proud of." She paused. "And because I need you to tie those ropes and I need you to understand why loose is right even when it feels wrong. And that's the same lesson." He nodded once. "Show me the knot," he said. She showed him the timber hitch on a spare length of rope, first on land the way Cormac had always insisted you learn a thing on land before you trusted it to the water. The mechanics of it, the way the loop formed, the way the wraps sat, the way the hitch locked under tension without jamming. And then the part Cormac had emphasized and she had understood intellectually and applied incorrectly, the size of the loop. The loop around the trunk had to be large. Larger than felt right, large enough that your instinct said it was going to slip, going to fail, going to let the house drift away on the current. Your instinct is wrong, she told him. The hitch itself won't slip, that's what the wraps are for. The loop slides up and down the trunk as the water level changes. If the loop is too small, it binds against the bark and can't slide. If it binds, the rope takes the full load of the rise instead of releasing it, and then it breaks. Reuben practiced the knot 3 times on a section of trunk she had cut for the purpose. The first attempt, the loop was too small, the way a first attempt is always too small, the hands defaulting to what feels secure. Larger, she said. He untied it, retied it, like still too small. He untied it again. Retied it. This time the loop sat around the test trunk with a generosity that made him look at it with visible discomfort, the instinct working against him exactly as she had predicted. That feels wrong, he said. I know, she said. Try to slide it. He slid the loop up the test trunk with 2 fingers. It moved without catching 6 inches, 8-10. That's right, she said. That feeling of wrong is the thing you have to learn to work through. He looked at the loop for another moment, testing it in his mind against everything he had learned about holding things in place. Cormac said, "Looser than you dare," he said. Yes. He said that to me specifically. I know. He knew I'd be the one doing this. He said it not as an accusation, but as a recognition, the slow arrival of understanding about why the old man had said what he said, to whom he had said it, and when. I think he knew a lot of things, Nora said. They started at the northwest anchor tree, the one that had failed, the one that had to be rebuilt from the anchor ring up. Reuben worked in the water up to his waist, the temperature of the basin in mid-October carrying the first real bite of the coming season, the cold that came down from the north in the night and settled into the deep water and stayed there, regardless of what the afternoon sun tried to do about it. He tied the first hitch. Nora looked at it. The loop was almost right. Almost. The wraps were sitting correctly flush but not jammed. But the loop itself was still a half-inch too small, not enough to matter in a moderate rise, but enough to bind under a surge. She showed him where. He untied, he retied, she looked at it. Good, she said. He moved to the northeast tree. She stood on the platform and watched and corrected once the wraps, this time the second wrap, pressing into the first the way Cormac had pointed out on Reuben's earlier work. He fixed it without being told twice. Southwest good on the first attempt. He came to the 4th anchor tree, the southeast corner, the farthest. From the main porch, the one that required swimming 15 feet through cold water to reach the trunk. Nora had cut the rope for it that morning from the coil Cormac's nephew had delivered. She did not tell him it was Cormac's rope. She handed him the length, and he swam it to the trunk and worked in the water with only his head and shoulders visible, the rope moving through his hands with the deliberateness of someone who is making something they intend last. He came back to the platform and pulled himself up, dripping. Done, he said. She went to each tree and checked. Northwest, the loop slid 4 inches up and 3 down without catching. Northeast, the same. Southwest, the loop was perhaps fractionally large, would slide within spec. Southeast, the 4th anchor, Cormac's rope, the loop sat around the cypress trunk with a generosity that would have made the old man nod. The wraps were loose against the bark. The hitch was set. The rope had the particular quality of something tied by a hand that had learned to trust what it could not fully feel. Good work, she said. He stood dripping on the platform and looked at the 4 trees and the 4 ropes and said nothing for a moment. Cormac would say, "Good work," Nora added. Something in Reuben's face shifted slightly at the old man's name. He turned and went inside to change his wet shirt, and Nora stood on the porch and looked at the 4 anchor lines and felt something she had not let herself feel since the morning after the flood. She felt that it was going to be all right, not certain, not guaranteed, but possible in a way it had not been possible before, which was enough. The rain came that afternoon. Not a storm this time, a slow, steady October rain from the northwest. The kind that means the season is turning for good and the last of the Gulf warmth has finally given ground. The water rose in the basin without drama, an inch at a time, the way water rises when it is in no particular hurry. Nora watched the ropes. The northwest loop slid up the cypress trunk an inch, then two, then three, moving without sound, without strain, the large, generous loop accommodating the rise, the way a hand opens to receive something instead of closing to grip it. Jasper stood on the porch in his coat and counted. 4 inches, he said. 5. He looked back at Nora. 6. The platform rose with the water. The wall stayed level. The lamp on the table inside did not swing. 7. Jasper's voice had taken on the particular quality of a child reporting something he finds both remarkable and absolutely natural, as if the world confirming what it was supposed to do is a source of straightforward satisfaction. 8. 8.5, Reuben said from the doorway. 8.5, Jasper agreed. The rain continued through the evening and into the night. By morning, the basin was 9 inches higher than it had been before the storm. All 4 ropes had slid up their cypress trunks in smooth silence. The platform sat level, the seam Nora had caulked with pine tar and rope fiber held without a drop. The rice in the garden, the only thing that had survived the previous storm's flooding, stood straight and healthy in the higher water, indifferent to the change, doing what rice had been doing in Louisiana for 200 years. Nora stood at the garden platform in the gray morning light and looked at the rice and thought about what survives. The news about Cormac came 4 days before the inspection. His nephew paddled up from the South Channel in the early morning with the particular quality of silence that belongs to people who are carrying news they have already had time to absorb. He came aboard and stood on the porch and told Nora that Cormac Frey had died 2 mornings before at first light in his own chair, on his own porch looking east toward the water. His nephew said he had been smiling. He said Cormac had asked to be buried on the high ground. His wife had kept a small parcel at the edge of the basin dry ground under a live oak that she had planted the year they arrived. He said Cormac had already been laid there. The nephew said 3 things on the porch railing, Cormac's clay pipe still smelling of the particular tobacco he used. His wide-brimmed felt hat sweat-stained along the band, shaped by 40 years of wearing into something that could only have belonged to him, and a small square of paper folded twice, sealed with a dab of pine tar in place of wax. Nora opened it. The handwriting was difficult, the hand of a man whose fingers had been giving him trouble. The letters formed with effort and care. She read it once to herself, then she read it again. The 4th rope is mine. I belled it the morning I came to say goodbye because I wanted to bring it myself and not send it with the boy. I belled the first rope I ever put on this basin 38 years ago. I belled this one the same morning. The rope has been waiting since the first time Henry said no. His boy tied it right, looser than he dared. That is enough. That is exactly enough. C.F. Nora stood on the porch for a long time with the note in her hand. She looked at the southeast anchor tree, at the rope running from the platform ring to the trunk, the large loops sitting loosely around the bark, Reuben's work the most careful knot on the platform. 38 years, Cormac had been carrying that rope since Henry first refused him. He had kept it on his own platform, maintained it, kept it sound, waiting for the moment when it would be used. The way it was intended to be used, not by a man who built on ground because he had decided that was what he was, but by a boy who had not yet learned to be afraid of looseness. She folded the note. She put it inside Henry's journal between the pages where his own handwriting and Cormac's note would sit together in the dark, 2 men's understanding of the same truth arriving at the same place from different directions. Reuben did not know. She would tell him one day, when he had built enough of his own life to hold the weight of it properly, when he understood not just the knot but everything. The knot meant the 38 years, the refusals, the rope kept in a coil on a dead man's porch because the right hands had not yet arrived to use it. Not yet. She went inside and began to prepare for the 31st of October. The last day of October arrived clear and cold. A hard blue sky, the kind that comes to Louisiana in the fall when the Gulf has finally stopped insisting on summer and the North has sent down its first real argument. The cypress canopy had turned in the night, the green needles going to a deep amber gold, the color of the basin in the week before it gave itself over entirely to the gray of winter. The water was still the way it is still after a cold night, and the light on it was the particular low-angled light of the season's turn, hitting the surface at an angle that made the whole basin look like hammered bronze. Nora was up before dawn. She built a stove fire and made coffee and stood on the porch in the cold with her cup and looked at the 4 anchor trees in the pre-light, the 4 rope lines running from the platform, rings to the trunks, the 4 loops sitting loosely around the cypress bark. She looked at them the way you look at something you have made that has become through the making of it more than what it was when you started. She went inside and woke the boys. "Get dressed," she said to Jasper. "Your clean shirt, the blue one." "Where are we going?" "You're nowhere. People are coming here." Reuben was already awake. He had been awake, she thought, for some time. He dressed without being asked and came to the table and ate his cornmeal in silence, and then went to stand at the southeast anchor tree, one hand resting lightly on the rope, the way he had been standing on inspection mornings when they tested the lines. Nora dressed carefully. Not formally, she had nothing formal, had not owned anything formal since before the flood, and formality was not what was required here. What was required was the particular kind of presentable that says, "I am a woman who has been working hard and have not forgotten what cleanliness means." She brushed her hair and put it up and put on the coat she had kept clean through the construction weeks by hanging it inside on the hook by the door. She made a second cup of coffee. She set the 3 documents on the table in a neat stack, each one notarized by Whitmore Giddens with the parish seal, the red wax mark she had watched him press into place in his quiet office beside the courthouse 3 days before. The first, a printed copy of Louisiana Civil Code Article 15, with the relevant passage underlined in Whitmore's careful hand. The tutor's duty is the care of the person of the minor, which care encompasses the minor's physical well-being, education, moral development, and the preservation of the minor's interests. It is not reducible to a fixed address or a particular form of dwelling. The second, a printed copy of Article 1493, Forced Heirship, the absolute protection of a minor child's inherited share, inviolable, not subject to alienation, sale, or transfer by any party except the child upon reaching majority. The third, the letter from Williams Lumber Company addressed to the parish courthouse in care of Whitmore Giddens, dated October 14th, 1897. She had read the Williams Lumber letter many times. She knew its contents the way you know the contents of something that determines the outcome of your life. The letter confirmed that on August 25th, 1897, she knew the date because she had counted backward from the date of the letter through the company's records, which they had provided in response to the parish sealed inquiry. Mr. Aldous Varner of Nashville, Tennessee, had written to Williams Lumber Company's Louisiana agent to inquire about the standing timber value on a parcel of cypress land in the Atchafalaya Basin, legally described by its deed coordinates. The company's agent had inspected the parcel by water and had responded to Mr. Varn with an estimated value of $2,400 for cutting rights. August 25th, 1897, Aldous had filed his tutorship petition on September 1st, 1897, 6 days. He had priced the timber, then he had filed for the children. Nora set the letter on top of the stack. She heard horses on the bank trail. They came at 9 o'clock, which was when she had expected them. Aldous Varn, first on his rented horse, his wool suit replaced with a heavier coat appropriate to the temperature, his expression composed into the particular blankness of a man who has calculated his position and found it satisfactory. Beside him, a thin man from Nashville named Branch, his lawyer brought down specifically for this, which told Nora something about how seriously Aldous now understood the stakes to be. Behind them on a bay horse, Sheriff Beckett Holt. The three of them came to the end of the bank trail where the ground gave out and the water began, and they stopped. The floating home sat 40 yards offshore, connected to nothing solid, the 4 rope lines running to the 4 cypress trunks, the cedar walls weathered to a silver gray. In the low October light, the tin chimney releasing a thin thread of wood smoke into the cold blue air. No dry causeway, no bridge, no way across without water. Nora pulled the skiff out from the platform and began to paddle toward them. Aldous began to speak when she was halfway across. His voice carried well on the cold, still air. Mrs. Caldwell, the conditions of this inspection require the conditions of a Louisiana Civil Code tutorship inspection, Nora said without stopping her paddling, require the sheriff to conduct the primary inspection. They prohibit the petitioner from direct participation during the inspection itself. She reached the bank and shipped the paddle and looked up at them. I can carry one person at a time. Sheriff Holt goes first. Aldous looked at Branch. Branch leaned close and said something in a low voice. Aldous's expression did not change, but something behind it did. He did not argue. Holt dismounted and handed his reins to Branch and stepped into the skiff without ceremony. He sat in the bow, and Nora paddled them across, and the skiff touched the platform edge, and Holt stepped up with the solidity of a large man who has learned to move carefully. Jasper was on the porch in his blue shirt. Reuben was at the southeast anchor tree, a hand on the rope. Holt looked at the platform. He looked at the walls. He looked at the rope lines running to the 4 trees. He looked at Reuben's hand on the rope and said nothing about it. Show me, he said. Jasper showed him. He showed him the garden platform, the rice standing in its rows, the winter squash that had survived both storms, the bean seedlings Nora had started in soil boxes after the potato rows drowned. He showed him the chicken coop on its small float tied to the main platform with a short line. He showed him the rain barrels, 2 of them full from the recent rain, fitted with cloth filters against debris. He showed him the inside of the house. The cast iron stove burning steadily, the surface temperature correct, the chimney drawing clean. Holt looked up the flue and saw daylight, which was what you needed to see. The food stores in the cabinet, salt preserved fish in glass jars, dried beans in 3 clay crocks, flour in a sealed tin, coffee rice in a burlap sack, dried corn. Enough for 2 months if they were careful, 3 if they were more careful than that. The bookshelves beside the stove. Holt looked at the books. He did not touch them, but he read the spines. The Bible. A Louisiana reader 3rd grade. A Louisiana reader 6th grade for Reuben. The Civil Code borrowed from Whitmore's office and not yet returned. Henry's journal, a small collection of poems, 2 arithmetic primers worn at the corners. The boys' school in Holt said. Every morning, Nora said. 2 hours of reading, 1 hour of arithmetic. Reuben is working through the 6th grade reader and beginning simple algebra. Jasper is reading at 4th grade level. She paused. I was a school teacher before I married. Holt looked at her. Then he went outside to look at the anchor ropes. Reuben walked him to all 4 trees moving around the platform in the clockwise direction that Cormac had taught them, systematic, complete. Nothing skipped. At each tree he demonstrated the loop, 2 fingers sliding the rope up the trunk, showing the clearance, showing the play. At the northwest tree, the one that had failed, the one Reuben had retied, he showed Holt the high water marks on the bark. The dark stain lines from previous floods, 3 of them, the highest one at 6 feet above the current waterline. This season, Reuben said, we've had 9 inches of rise in 2 events. The ropes accommodated both. He showed the wraps of the hitch. There's enough loop to handle 6 feet of rise, 8 if the wraps are set right. Holt looked at the hitch for a long moment. Who taught you this? He said. A man named Cormac Frey, Reuben said. He died 4 days ago. Holt was quiet for a moment. I knew Frey, he said. Knew of him. He had a reputation in this parish. He looked at the hitch again. He taught you to tie it this way with this much play. He said loose is right even when it feels wrong, Reuben said. He said the rope that can't move will break. He said design for what the water does not for what you hope it will do. Holt looked at the boy for a moment with an expression that was not quite readable. Something that had to do with recognition, perhaps the recognition of someone who has heard a true thing stated plainly. A light rain began while they were standing at the northwest tree. Neither of them moved. The northwest loop slid up the cypress bark 1 inch, then 2. The platform rose with the water imperceptible to the eye, detectable only by the slow movement of the rope against the trunk, the rope doing precisely what it had been designed to do, accommodating rather than resisting rising with what came. Holt watched it. His face changed very slightly, the specific expression of a person watching a principle demonstrated in practice, the gap between the intellectual and the actual closing in real time. Mrs. Caldwell, he said, turning to Nora. Anything for the record? She went inside and came back with the 3 documents. She handed them to him one at a time. Article 15. He read it carefully all the way through, not skimming. He handed it back. Article 1493. The same. He read slowly with the deliberateness of a man who understands that legal language is precise and precision matters. He handed it back. The Williams Lumber letter. He read it once, he read it again, he turned it over and looked at the back as if expecting something on the reverse. He turned it face up again and read the date, August 25th, and then the date of Aldous' petition filing, which was referenced in the letter's preamble and which was September 1st. He folded the letter very carefully along its original creases. He placed all 3 documents inside his coat. He looked at the platform, at the house, at the garden, at the 4 anchor ropes, at Reuben standing at the southeast tree with his hand resting on the rope he had tied, at Jasper, who had come back out onto the porch and was standing with his arms at his sides watching Sheriff Holt with the complete and guileless attention of a 7-year-old who understands that something important is happening. I've seen what I need to see, Holt said. He said it to the platform generally, to the house and the ropes and the garden and the morning. Then he looked at Nora. I'll need to be paddled back. She paddled him back across the 40 yards of still October water, the rain light on the surface around them, the skiff moving in silence. On the bank, Aldous was waiting. Branch stood slightly behind him with the expression of a lawyer who has begun to calculate alternative positions. Holt stepped out of the skiff and took his horse's reins from Branch and stood for a moment looking back at the floating home across the water. Then he looked at Aldous. Mr. Varn, he said. Aldous straightened slightly. I trust that you found the condition of the... I'll need to see you at the courthouse tomorrow morning, Holt said. 9 o'clock. Bring Mr. Branch. Aldous's expression held for a moment. Then something in it shifted, the first crack in the composed surface, the first visible evidence that the calculation had not come out the way he expected. Sheriff, I am confident that the inspection reveals I found the dwelling safer than your brother's cabin was, Holt said, and I have 3 documents that will be read into the record tomorrow before Judge Harwick. He mounted his horse. He looked at Aldous from the elevation of the saddle with the particular quality of authority that belongs to a large, quiet man who rarely needs to raise his voice. 9 o'clock. He rode away down the bank trail. Aldous stood on the bank for a long moment, looking across the water at the floating home, at Nora, standing in the skiff with the paddle across her knees, at Reuben and Jasper on the porch. Then he turned his horse and followed the sheriff with Branch behind him, and they were gone around the bend of the bank trail, and the sound of the horses diminished, and then was gone, and there was only the rain and the water and the October light. The hearing the following morning was brief. Judge Harwick was a compact, dry-voiced man in his 60s who had presided over the St. Mary Parish Court for 20 years and had developed across those 2 decades the particular economy of a person who has heard most of what people have to say to one another and has learned to identify the essential parts quickly. Sheriff Holt presented his inspection report. He spoke for 8 minutes. He described the structure, the garden, the food stores, the educational materials, the anchor system. He described the rain during the inspection and what he had observed the northwest robe doing as the water rose. He described the condition of Henry Caldwell's original cabin site on the high ground which he had examined on his way out to the water. Then the 3 documents were read into the record. Article 15. The clerk read it in a flat, professional voice, the language of the code precise and unambiguous. The tutor's duty is the care of the person of the minor. It is not reducible to a fixed address. Article 1493. The clerk read it the same way. The forced heir cannot be deprived of the portion of the estate reserved to them by law. No tutorship arrangement may result in the alienation of a forced heir's reserved portion. The Williams Lumber Letter. The clerk read it in the same flat, professional voice. He read the date of the inquiry, August 25th, 1897. He read the value quoted, $2,400 for cutting rights on the Caldwell Cypress parcel. He read the name of the inquiring party, Mr. Aldous Varn of Nashville, Tennessee. When the date was read, August 25th, and then the tutorship petition date from the court's own filing records, September 1st, the room went quiet in a specific way. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of comprehension. The quiet that happens when a room full of people understands simultaneously what a sequence of dates means. Aldous sat at the petitioner's table with his hands folded and said nothing. Branch spoke for him briefly. He made an argument about the legitimacy of timber valuation as a routine inquiry unrelated to the tutorship petition. The argument was not without logic. It was not sufficient. Judge Harwick looked at the 3 documents for a moment. Then he spoke 4 sentences. Petition denied. The dwelling at the Caldwell Cypress parcel is judged safe and sufficient for the maintenance and upbringing of the minor children Reuben and Jasper Caldwell. The natural tutorship of the mother, Nora Caldwell, is hereby confirmed. The petitioner is ordered to pay court costs of $18 and is prohibited from refiling without the presentation of material evidence not available at this proceeding. He set the documents down. He looked at the room once briefly. Then he picked up the next file from the stack on his bench, and the hearing was over. Nora walked out of the courthouse into the November morning. The air was cold and clean, the sky the particular hard blue of late autumn, the kind of blue that has no warmth in it and does not pretend to. The levee was brown and dry above the low water line. A crow called twice from somewhere beyond the buildings and was silent. Whitmore walked beside her. He did not speak. He understood in the way of a man who has spent his career at the border between what the law says and what people's lives are, that there are moments when presence is the correct offering and words are not. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, Reuben and Jasper were waiting. Reuben had his hands in his coat pockets. Jasper was sitting on the bottom step with a stick, drawing patterns in the dirt, the way he drew patterns in the skiff floor, the way he drew patterns wherever he was and whatever was available. His small particular mind always making shapes in the world around him. He looked up when Nora reached the bottom step. "Well," he said, "we go home," Nora said. Jasper stood up and brushed the dirt from his coat with the brisk efficiency of a child moving from one thing to the next. Reuben looked at his mother for a moment. He looked at her the way you look at someone you have been watching carefully and are now sure about. He nodded once. They walked to the levee and down to the water landing and got into the skiff, and Reuben rowed them home. 2 years later, in the spring of 1899, a woman named Dorinda Spade pulled a leaking pirogue up to Nora's platform at first light on a Tuesday morning. She had 2 children with her, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4. She had been on the water since before dawn. Behind her, 3 days at most, was a creditor with a writ and a male cousin with a tutorship petition already drafted and waiting to be filed. Her husband had died in the winter, influenza not flood, the land was good land. The timber on it was worth considerably more than she had known until the cousin's inquiry. She tied the pirogue to the platform cleat and stood in the cold morning with her children and looked at the floating home and at the woman standing on its porch with a coffee cup. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, I was told you might." She stopped. She looked at the 4 rope lines running to the 4 cypress trunks. "I don't know what I'm asking. You're asking to come in," Nora said. "So come in." Dorinda Spade stayed 14 weeks. In that time, she learned to fall a cypress deadfall to square and lash a platform frame to test a joint by weight before trusting it to load. She learned the bowline, the clove hitch, the timber hitch, and how large the loop had to be, larger than felt right, larger than her hands wanted to make it. She learned to read the Louisiana Civil Code aloud in the evenings, the relevant articles, the language of them until the words sat in her memory, the way useful things sit when you have put them there with intention. She learned to write a parish sealed letter. She built her own floating home 1.5 miles west of Nora's, anchored to 4 cypress trunks in a stand. She had found herself reading the watermarks on the trunks the way Reuben had shown her. She named her daughter Harriet, for the woman Cormac Frey had loved and buried on high ground, whom Dorinda had never met, whose name she knew because Nora had told her the whole story, beginning with the flood and ending with the rope. In the autumn of 1912, 15 years after the inspection, on the last day of October, there were 27 floating homes in the Atchafalaya Basin. 11 of them had been built by widows. 9 of those 11 had won tutorship petitions by presenting 3 documents to a court: Article 15, Article 1493, and a parish sealed letter confirming that the petitioner had contacted a timber company before filing for custody of the children. Whitmore Gideon served as parish notary for 22 more years after the Caldwell hearing. In his retirement memoir, written for his family and not intended for wider circulation, he noted that he had processed 141 parish sealed letters in his career. He did not specify how many of them had been written by women standing at the edge of something they were not sure they could survive, and how many of those women had survived it anyway. He did not need to specify. The number was the same. Reuben Caldwell married in 1905 when he was 22 years old. His wife was a woman from a floating family on Bayou Chen, a family that had been on the water for 2 generations and kept their civil code on the same shelf as their Bible, which Reuben understood immediately and found in a way he could not quite articulate deeply correct. By 1908, when he was 25, he had built 16 homes. Each one was his own design, developed across the years, from Cormac's original system for anchors, for ropes, the loops large and loose, the platform cypress throughout the garden, platform separate and connected by a rope bridge, the stove against the interior wall opposite the door for heat distribution. Each home had a shelf beside the stove. On each shelf, the Louisiana Civil Code, a Bible, and a hand-copied transcript of Henry Caldwell's journal copied by Reuben himself in his own careful hand for each family he built for. Not all of it, the parts that mattered, the entry about Cormac and the refusals and the pride that had become a trap, the entry about the spring flood of the previous year and what Henry had seen in the water, the entry that ended, "I think I was wrong about what kind of man I needed to be. I think the land has been trying to tell me something for 11 years and I have not been listening. I will listen now. I intend to listen now." He had written that entry 2 weeks before the flood that killed him. Reuben always copied that one last. In the autumn of 1937, Nora Caldwell sat on the porch of her floating home in the last of the day's light. She was 68 years old. Her hair had gone white in her early 50s all at once, the way some people's hair goes when the body decides it has carried enough color and would prefer clarity. Her hands were the hands of someone who had been working with cypress and rope for 40 years. The palms thickened, the fingers slightly bent at the outer joints, the skin carrying the particular weathered quality of a life lived in close contact with weather and water and the materials of construction. The home had been rebuilt twice. The original platform had been replaced in 1911 and again in 1924. The walls had been replaced in sections as the cedar aged. The tin roof had been replaced entirely once. The stove was the same stove, the cast iron one she had pulled from the mud of Henry's cabin foundation in the fall of 1897, cleaned and seasoned and carried onto the first platform and never replaced because it worked and working things deserved continuity. The 4 cypress trees were the same trees. They had grown 9 feet taller. The ropes were not the same ropes were and were replaced season by season, year by year. But the system was the same. The loops were the same generous, counterintuitive, correct size they had always been. The platform rose with the water and fell with the water and had never in 40 years done anything else. Nora heard the skiff before she saw it. Coming in from the west channel, the paddle strokes, irregular. A small person strokes the technique present, but the strength still growing into itself. She watched the skiff come around the anchor tree and into the clear water of the platform space, and saw her granddaughter standing in the bow, paddling with the focus of someone who has decided to be good at this and is working on it. Harriet was 6 years old. She was Reuben's daughter, named at Reuben's quiet insistence, for the woman Cormac Frey had loved a woman Harriet had never met and knew only as a name and a shape in a story. She had her father's stillness and her grandmother's eyes and a quality of attention that people who met her for the first time invariably described as unusual in a child her age. In the skiff, stacked carefully in the bow, a set of slate boards and chalk, a reader, a small wooden box with a latch that Nora did not recognize. Harriet tied the skiff to the platform cleat with a bowline, a correct bowline, tied without looking, her hands knowing it, the way hands know things that have been practiced past the point of thinking. She climbed up onto the platform and stood in front of Nora in the October light. "Mama Grand," she said, "tell me a story." "What kind of story? The real one." She sat down on the porch beside Nora with the ease of someone who has sat in this exact spot many times before. "About why we live on the water, about why it's right." Nora looked at the 4 ropes, at the cypress trunks taller now than they had been when she first stood between them in the water up to her thighs, lashing logs with hands that did not yet fully know what they were doing. At the water below, dark in the October shade, carrying the reflection of the gold canopy above. She put her arm around the small shoulders beside her. "Your great-grandfather, Henry," she said, "was a good man. He was one of the best men I have known. He worked hard and he loved his family and he built things with his own hands that he was right to be proud of." She paused. "And he tried to stand against the water like it was his enemy. He decided before he understood this place what kind of man he was going to be and what kind of life he was going to build. And when the water told him something different, he could not hear it. Not because he was foolish, because he was brave in the wrong direction." Harriet was looking at the water. "What happened to him?" she said, though she knew. Children ask the questions they know the answers to when what they need is not information but the sound of the answer in a voice they trust. "The water told him the truth," Nora said, "the way the water always tells the truth eventually, and he was not ready." Harriet was quiet for a moment. "Are we ready?" she said. Nora looked at the ropes, at the loops sitting loosely around the trunks, ready to slide, designed to accommodate, built to rise with whatever came. We practice being ready, she said. Every day. That's what the ropes are for. That's what the knots are for. Not to hold on tight, to hold on right. She looked down at the small dark head leaning against her side. There is a difference. The difference is everything. Harriet thought about this. Tell me the rest, she said. So Nora told her. She told her about the 90 days and the $14.30. She told her about Whitmore Giddens and the civil code and the two articles that said what children were owed and what a mother's duty was. She told her about Cormac Frey, the engineer who had made a structure that failed and spent the rest of his life learning to make structures that did not fail by learning to stop fighting the water. She told her about Aldous Varna and the timber letter and the date that was 6 days before the petition and what that date meant in a courtroom before a judge who read carefully. She told her about the rope that broke in the storm because it had been tied too tight by hands that were trying to hold on instead of let go. She told her about Reuben tying the 4-tanker Cormac's rope, though she did not mention that part, saving it for another year, another evening when Harriet was old enough to carry the weight of 38 years of waiting, and about the rain coming that afternoon and the ropes sliding up the trunks in the silence of things working as they should. She told her about Sheriff Holt reading the date on the Williams Lumber letter and the room going quiet. She told her about walking out of the courthouse into the cold November morning and her boys waiting on the bottom step and Jasper brushing the dirt from his coat and Reuben's single nod. She told her about Dorinda Spade and the leaking pirogue at first light, about the 14 weeks and the knots and the civil code read aloud in the evenings, about the home a mile and a half to the west and the daughter named Harriet. She told her about the 27 homes. The sun went down behind the cypress canopy while she talked. The water took on the deep grey blue of late October dusk. Inside the house, the stove fire gave its light through the open door, the same cast iron stove that had stood on the mud floor of Henry's ruined cabin and been pulled free and carried here 40 years ago, still doing what it had always done. When she finished, Harriet was quiet for a moment, then she said, "What bends survives." Nora looked at her. "Who told you that?" "Papa, he says it about the ropes." She paused. "He says you taught him." "Someone taught me," Nora said, "and someone taught him, and now I'm telling you." She looked at the water. "That's how it works. That's how all of it works. Not written in books, not stored in buildings. Passed from one pair of hands to the next. Taught in the doing of it, in the practice of it, in the getting it wrong, and the correcting, and the doing it again until the hands know it better than the mind does." Harriet leaned against Nora's side. The water rocked them both gently as it had been rocking this porch for 40 years. "What bends survives," Harriet said again, quietly. "The way you say something when you are putting it somewhere inside you where it will stay." "What resists breaks," Nora said, "or rise with what comes." "Rise with what comes," Harriet repeated. The lamp inside brightened as the evening deepened. The water held them both. The 4 ropes sat loosely in their loops against the 4 cypress trunks, ready to rise, ready to fall, designed for exactly this, the ordinary, extraordinary endurance of a life built not against the water, but with it, not in spite of what comes, but in accommodation of it, in the patient practice, daily discipline of letting go of the rope just enough to hold.